What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about U.S. zoning. Now, this has been on my mind for, a little bit of time. I'm not going to lie. I just never knew about this, U.S. zoning. And I could never articulate it, but I always felt this way. Not always, but probably about a year ago, I remember feeling like, maybe a year or two ago, I remember feeling like things in the U.S. are very separate and obviously right now we're very divided, but I don't just mean that we connect a lot through technology and not as much in person, but also like physically, spatially, we are very distant from each other. And I can never articulate this feeling, but this sense of being socially isolated and like everyone is far apart from each other, and there's not really any designated social spaces to connect. I've always kind of felt this, but I didn't know how to explain it or what it was. But finally, the other day, I was watching some video and I heard some guy talk about U.S. zoning and zoning laws, and how this is basically a big part of the reason on why our space is designed based on separation. Um, and so in many other countries, I mean, let's start off with like what is like zoning. Well, apparently, from my understanding, zoning is kind of like you have certain areas in a society that are designated for certain things. So I know there's places for like residential zones, commercial zones. What else? Industrial zones. So residential where people live, commercial, like stores, malls, and industrial like factories where things are produced. And these are all in separate zones. Now, the thing with this is that um, it's the reason for zoning is to have things organized and in their place. Um, but that's like one of the reasons, because although it gives order, I think there's a lot of different motivations behind it, which I'm not too aware of these certain motivations. But particularly in the U.S., we do this thing called, uh, I think it's single use zoning. So basically, where you can have zones where you mix both commercial and residential like usages for the property. When you do this, it comes with certain pros and there's certain cons. But in the U.S., we do single use zoning, so meaning that the the buildings you can build in that zone are can only be used for that purpose. So, for example, if it's a residential zone, you can only those buildings can only be used for for living there for residents. If it's a commercial zone, that zone can only be used for malls and stores and but there can't be anybody living, like those buildings can't be used for living. Now the problem with this is that it creates this new term that I've heard of, which is called a car centric society. This term car centric. Now in the US, you need a car to live. The way things are designed and spaced out, the zoning, the laws that they put for the zoning in the U.S., you are almost required, like, you're basically forced to buy a car. Now, there's many problems with this because I think this leads to a lot of disconnection. And I have personally felt this myself because I didn't have a car for a while. And, if you don't have a car, you literally can't live your life. You can't go to work. You can't go to, places to connect with people because everyone lives so far from each other. Um, and you can't just, there aren't grocery stores nearby. You can't just walk to the grocery store. You can't just walk to the mall. You can't just walk to, the gym. You have to literally drive everywhere. And there's pros and cons to the way, certain societies are designed. But in other countries, you can actually walk to the mall and the gym, and everything is. There's a lot of, like, countries that have things in a walkable distance, where you don't have to depend on a car. But in the U.S., you have to depend on a car, and I think this creates a lot of problems because, for one, if you're poor, right, and let's say you can't afford a car, but you need to get to work, then how are you going to save up for the car when you are having trouble commuting to work and saving up for that? Um, that that puts, poor people, the lower class, in a really difficult position. And so, and also, you know, the people who keep these businesses running, the lower class people who are, get paid minimum wage, these are the people that struggle with getting a car and buying transportation to get to work. Yet nothing is done for these people, right? You're still forced to buy a car, and not only that, but then our society, the U.S. has no other alternatives, right? The sidewalks are still don't do it justice. You have to cross, these sometimes huge, like, 5 lane streets that are extremely dangerous. Pedestrians in the car are not really used to watching out for people walking. They're kind of just focused on the cars themselves. And, not many bike lanes. A lot of it is just made for cars. And like I said, I think this leads to a lot of disconnection. And really, I think this lack of community that we have now has a lot to do with, zoning and this area of, like, urban planning. Again, the way our environment is designed, the way buildings are designed, the way zones are designed, it really doesn't foster community. Um, I just think about the amount of people that you pass by. You probably pass by hundreds of people in a day driving here, at least in a city like I live in, and you are not connecting with any of those people. Whereas if you lived in a country where you're walking, you have the ability to walk to buy groceries, to shop, to go to the mall, to watch a movie, whatever, or to go to your friend's house, you would be passing by a lot of people and actually somewhat having some sort of interaction. But here, it's like as soon as you get out of your house, then, you're automatically in a bubble once you're in the car, and there's no more connection with the outside. And then the only your only perception of people is like them in a car closed off to you, and they're just kind of like a machine. You know what I mean? You don't really see them as a human. And whereas if you were walking and other people were walking, there'd be some chance to foster some community. Maybe, it'd be very natural for communities to be created. Um, but the way things are spaced out and designed is is caused to separate us, and it's caused to make us pay more money, right? Um, I also heard this one thing about cars. Basically, things are so zoned out so they can also make you pay for more gas. And I think things were designed a different way in the past in the US, but I think ever since Henry Ford and, the Industrial Revolution and mass productions of cars started, this is when the spacing started to get designated more, or designed rather, for that than actually fostering, community and making the design for humans and for the well-being of humans. This completely, I think, changed after the Industrial Revolution. And so it's bizarre, man. I really think it's it's not a good way of living. I feel like we should have multiple. We shouldn't just only solely be dependent on cars. And if you go to a different country, you can feel the difference. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I just think it's really it's something that I've felt for a while, and I didn't know how to express it. But it's basically that's what it is. It's called U.S. zoning, U.S. zoning, and zoning laws. And so, and these things kind of keep things in their position, and you can't really, again, it's why everything is just physically distant. And I just don't think you can have a community in person when things are so distant and you have to depend on a car. Um, it doesn't make any sense. And but not only that, but I think this the way things are designed to cause us to be separated, I think is also connected to this underlying narrative or this underlying truth of how can I put this? That ultimately these people who are in position of power, whether in the government or in corporations, because people in position of power are starting to blend, right? It's not just the government now; it's mass corporations as well. They want us to be divided, and I'm not really too sure. I mean, obviously, I think when we're divided, we are less powerful, and we have less agency over our lives, and they want to sort of make us like hamsters in a wheel, solely dependent on them, so they can keep you know uh, the power, so they can stay in position of power, and pretty much I don't want to say control the masses, but pretty much keep the masses in a certain place where they don't have the power, and where they don't have say in the politics and in the decisions the government makes. Um, and I think this urban planning, this zoning, has a deep connection with that, because at the heart of it, right? If your society is car centric, then you're already forced to play into the game of money. Like, and I know this is really controversial, and it goes against you know the culture, but at the end of the day, I mean, yeah, like from the moment you start, it's like you need a car. Like, you're already faced with having to pay, right? Like, in other countries where you can walk or bike, you can save so much money and live so frugally for and you can basically live frugally and live your life. But it's basically, yeah, the car industry wants you to pay for a car. The people with oil, they want you to pay for gas. So they make things very separate. They make things where you need a car. And yeah, it's just they get you in the rat race is what I'm trying to say. They get you in the rat race off the bat. Not only that, but with education, right? Education, immediately by the time you're 18, you're still a kid. You don't know what the hell's going on. You've been institutionalized by school, by the school system. And by the time you just already start to get a higher education, boom, you're getting clapped. Now you got to pay for that. And it's a lot of money. It's not a little bit. And a lot of times, a lot of people who are in the lower class have to get in debt just for the higher education. That already starting the rat race. And then, so you got to get in debt for higher education just to get a job You gotta um, you need a car. So they're putting you in this wheel, and they want you to be a hamster, and they do it off the bat, right? In other countries where there is free education, right, you don't have to go into the rat race, but you can actually still develop and not be a slave off the bat, and not be at a disadvantage from the start. You can get education, you can find your position and place comfortably with no pressure and no risk of your survival, and then you can actually be a developed human, a developed citizen, and be in a position where you actually make a difference, where you actually want to be, and be happy, and make society overall better, right? And you can also walk. You don't have to pay a car. You don't have to slave away. You don't have to slave and give your life away and do things that you don't want to do because other people are trying to profit off of you. No, you don't have to do that, right? But here in the US, boom, you're in debt. Off the moment you start higher education, whether you start trade school or whatever, boom, car. So now you're in the rat race. You have to work. You people are going to use you, and it's ridiculous. And I think that's a little bit off track, but I think this U.S. zoning all connects with that. Um, and like I said, it's very insidious. We are physically distant, and we have to find a way where we can live, where we are not just car dependent, where we can take trains and buses and bikes and walk, and foster a sense of community rather than just give a fuck about profit and that's it, and neglect all the humans. And that, again, connects with the data centers that are being built right now, which that's a whole other topic for another day. But yeah, it's just crazy. The trajectory we're going down is leading to a collapse. And yeah, so stay connected, guys. Stay healthy. Stay at peace. Spread that love, peace, and joy. And I love you guys all. Thank you for everything. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace, y'all.